You're just a bottleneck, Vera, Jared said, laughing as he kicked me off the $40 million project I'd spent 6 months building. He thought he was streamlining operations by pushing me aside. He didn't realize he was actually turning his own logistics company into a smuggling ring. You see, in international trade, there's a razor-thin line between agile shipping and a federal crime. That line was my personal customs broker license. And when he told me to step back, I didn't argue. I just took my license with me. Before I reveal how my silence triggered a federal investigation, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments. And if you've ever been punished for doing your job too well, hit that subscribe button. This story is for you. Let me tell you exactly how one missing signature cost them everything. My name is Vera Caldlow, and I am the person who keeps the CEO of Apex Meridian Logistics out of federal handcuffs. That is not a title you will find on my business card. My official designation is Director of Trade Compliance, a role that, to the uninitiated, sounds like a librarian of cardboard boxes. But in the high-stakes world of international freight, where a single mislabeled shipping container can trigger a diplomatic incident or a $10 million fine, I am the firewall. I am 52 years old, born in the Rust Belt of Ohio, where rules were not suggestions but survival mechanisms. For 15 years, I have arrived at this glass tower in Chicago at 7:30 a.m. sharp, and for 15 years, I have been the invisible hand that guides billion-dollar inventories through the minefield of global tariffs, sanctions, and export controls. I am the reason our shipments do not get seized. I am the reason our accounts remain frozen. I am the reason the company sleeps at night, even if they have never bothered to learn my middle name. Invisibility is a comfortable cloak until someone decides it is actually obsolescence. That realization hit me with the force of a physical blow on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, inside the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor. The room was a monument to corporate excess floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, a table made of reclaimed mahogany that cost more than my annual mortgage payments, and air conditioning set to a temperature that required a wool blazer in July. We were gathered for the final strategy session of Project Zenith. This was not just another contract. It was the Leviathan, a $40 million agreement to transport specialized wind turbine nacelles and advanced guidance chips to a consortium in Northern Europe. The deal was the brainchild of Jared Sterling, our new Vice President of Operations. Jared was 31 years old, a man who had been headhunted from a tech startup in Silicon Valley and dropped into the complex world of industrial logistics like a grenade. He wore suits that shimmered under the fluorescent lights and spoke in a language of buzzwords: synergy, disruption, velocity. To Jared, the intricate laws of international trade were not guardrails, they were friction. And Jared hated friction. I was standing at the head of the table, the light from the projector illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I was 60 minutes into a presentation detailing the specific regulatory hurdles for the guidance chips. These were dual-use items, meaning while they were designed for green energy, their architecture was uncomfortably similar to the guidance systems used in ballistic missiles. The Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, required a specific end-user statement, a document that took 72 hours to verify. 72 hours? Jared interrupted. He didn't look at me. He was looking at his phone, scrolling through what I assumed was a LinkedIn feed. He swiveled his chair, the expensive leather creaking in the silence. Vera, we promised the client an expedited timeline. Agile delivery is the selling point. If we wait 3 days for a piece of paper, we miss the launch window. I adjusted my glasses, keeping my voice level. It is not just a piece of paper, Jared. It is a federal requirement under the Export Administration regulations. If we ship without it, we are trafficking in controlled technology. The fine is $250,000 per violation and potential prison time. Jared laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a dry, dismissive bark. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. To his right, Bree, his 23-year-old executive assistant, mirrored his expression, a small, pitying smile playing on her lips. You see, this is the problem, Jared said, addressing the room rather than me. He gestured at me, as if I were a piece of broken office furniture. We are trying to build a Ferrari here, and Vera is worried about the speed limit signs. Vera, you are drowning us in red tape. You lack executive presence." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Executive presence. It was the corporate polite way of saying I was too old, too careful, and too unglamorous for his vision of the future. "Executive presence," he repeated, leaning back and interlocking his fingers behind his head. "We need leaders with vision, Vera. People who see the destination, not the potholes. Your constant no is a bottleneck. It's suffocating the team's morale. So here is the new plan." He didn't ask, he commanded. "I am restructuring the approval matrix. Effective immediately, the compliance review for Project Zenith will bypass your desk. I will personally sign off on the milestones. You can focus on the archiving. Clean up the database. Organize the old files. Stay in your lane, Vera. Let the people who know how to drive take the wheel." I looked around the room. I looked at the sales director, a man whose ass I had saved from a lawsuit 3 years ago. He looked down at his notepad. I looked at the HR representative. She was studiously examining her cuticles. Silence. Absolute, complicit silence. They were trading my safety for Jared's speed. In that silence, something inside me fractured. But it wasn't a break. It was a release. It was the sound of a heavy chain snapping, freeing me from a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I slowly closed my laptop. I capped my fountain pen with a deliberate click. "Understood," I said. My voice was so calm it sounded foreign to my own ears. "You feel I am a bottleneck. You want speed. I will no longer stand in your way." I walked out of that room with my spine straight, leaving the chilly air of the boardroom for the warmer, stale air of the hallway. I walked past the break room, where the coffee pot was burning, past the rows of cubicles where younger employees were frantically typing, unaware that the safety net had just been cut. When I entered my office, I didn't sit down immediately. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the hum of the server closet next door. I looked at the framed certificate on my wall, licensed customs broker, Vera Caldlow. It was issued to me, not the company. It was my intellectual property, my legal identity. For 15 years, I had voluntarily linked this license to Apex Meridian's corporate tax ID, allowing them to operate as a legal brokerage. It was a privilege I granted them, not a right they owned. I sat down at my desk and logged into the automated commercial environment, ACE, the secure government portal that tracks every import and export in the United States. The interface was gray and utilitarian, a stark contrast to the flashy, colorful dashboards Jared preferred. My hands moved with the muscle memory of a pianist. I navigated to the Account Management tab. I found the Broker Association link. There it was, Apex Meridian Logistics, active. I hovered my mouse over the Disassociate button. A dialog box popped up. Warning. This action will revoke the entity's ability to file customs entries under this license. Are you sure? I thought about Jared's smirk. I thought about the silence in the boardroom. I thought about the phrase executive presence. "I am just staying in my lane," I whispered to the empty room. I clicked confirm. The screen blinked once, then refreshed. Association removed. Next, I opened the company's internal ERP system. I went into the workflow settings for the shipping module. I found my name in the mandatory approval logic block. I deleted it. I replaced it with Jared Sterling, Vice President. Then, I turned off the auto-correction script I had written 5 years ago, a script that silently fixed common data entry errors made by the sales team before they reached the government servers. I had been correcting their spelling mistakes and code errors for years without them knowing. Now, they would have to spell for themselves. I spent the rest of the afternoon packing a small box with my personal items, my spare glasses, a photo of my niece, my favorite ceramic mug. I drafted a single email to Jared, copying legal and HR. Subject, compliance handover. Jared, per your directive in today's meeting, I have removed myself from the operational approval chain to eliminate the bottleneck. I have transferred all override authority to your user profile. I will proceed with the archival duties as requested. Regards, Vera. At 5 p.m. exactly, I put on my trench coat. I walked to the elevator bank. Oren, our systems administrator, was there. Orrin was a man of few words, a 50-year-old veteran of the IT wars who knew where every digital skeleton was buried. He looked at my box. He looked at the time. "Leaving on time, Vera?" he asked, his eyebrows raising slightly. "I'm just archiving, Orrin," I said, stepping into the elevator. "The decision-making is upstairs now." The doors closed, and for the first time in a decade, I went home while the sun was still up. I sat on my porch, drank a glass of iced tea, and watched the cars drive by. I felt light. Terrifyingly, beautifully light. Wednesday and Thursday passed in a surreal haze. I came to work, I sat in my office, and I scanned old paper files from 2012 into the digital archive. I did exactly what I was told. Outside my glass walls, the office was buzzing with the frantic energy of the new apex. Jared was holding stand-up meetings, high-fiving sales reps, and talking about crushing Q4. But the supply chain is a creature of delayed reaction. It takes time for the poison to circulate. The first symptom appeared on Thursday afternoon, around 2 p.m. Bree, Jared's assistant, appeared at my door. She looked less smug than she had in the meeting. Her hair was slightly frizzy, and she was clutching a sheaf of papers. "Vera?" she asked, hesitating at the threshold. "Sorry to bother you. The warehouse in Long Beach is calling. They have 3 containers of consumer electronics sitting at the gate. The drivers are threatening to leave." I swiveled my chair slowly. "What seems to be the problem, Bree? They can't print the release forms," she said, frustration creeping into her voice. "The system keeps giving an error. Error 505, missing POA, license mismatch. I've restarted the computer 3 times. It won't go away." I knew exactly what the error was. The system was trying to ping my license to validate the bond, and it was finding a void. Without a valid broker license attached to the transaction, the software couldn't generate the legal entry summary. The goods were effectively undocumented immigrants. "That sounds like a technical permission issue," I said, my voice dripping with sympathy. "But as you recall, Jared was very clear that I am not to be involved in operational bottlenecks. He took over the approval authority." Bree blinked. "But Jared doesn't know how to fix this. He doesn't know the codes. He is the vice president of operations, Bree," I said gently. "He has executive presence. I am sure he can figure out a simple computer glitch. You should ask him." Bree stood there for a moment, stunned, before turning on her heel and marching toward the corner office. 10 minutes later, the storm broke. I heard Jared's door slam. I heard his heavy footsteps stomping down the carpeted hallway towards the IT department. He didn't come to me. His ego was too fragile to ask for help from the woman he had just publicly castrated. Instead, he went to bully the machine. I stood up and walked to the doorway, leaning against the frame, holding a lukewarm cup of tea. I had a clear line of sight to the IT help desk. Jared was leaning over a junior technician, a kid named Kevin, who looked like he was about to cry. "I don't care what the damn manual says," Jared was shouting. "We have deadlines. Why is the system blocking a standard shipment?" "Sir," Kevin stammered, "it's a hard stop. The validation check is failing at the root level. It says the license isn't active." "The license is fine," Jared roared. "We've been shipping for 20 years. It's a glitch in this archaic software Vera installed. Override it." I can't, sir. That's a safety protocol. I am authorizing you." I watched, fascinated. This was the moment, the crucial pivot point. If Jared had been a humble man, he would have paused. He would have asked why. He was a man who believed that rules were for little people. Kevin typed in the password for developer mode, a back-end access used for system testing, never for live operations. He slid the keyboard to Jared. Jared sat down. He pulled up the shipment. The screen flashed red. Warning. Compliance check failed. Forced submission? It was a digital cliff. Jared looked at the screen. He looked at the time on his Rolex. Then, he looked across the room and locked eyes with me. I raised my teacup in a silent toast. "Go ahead, Jared. Show us your speed." He sneered, looked back at the screen, and clicked the box. Force submission. He hit enter. The printer behind the desk whirred to life. The release forms slid out. Jared grabbed them, stood up, and waved them in the air like a victory flag. "See?" he shouted to the room. "You don't need a committee to fix a problem. You need action." He walked past me, breathless and triumphant. "Solved, Vera," he muttered as he passed. "While you were watching, I was solving." "Noted," I whispered. He hadn't solved it. By forcing the submission in developer mode, he had bypassed the pre-filing validation. He had tricked the internal system into printing the paper, but he hadn't fixed the digital handshake with the government. He had just released cargo into the commerce of the United States without a legal declarant. It was a clerical error for a toaster oven. But for what was coming next, it was a death sentence. Friday arrived, the day of Project Zenith. The atmosphere in the office was manic. The $40 million shipment, 6 massive containers of turbine components, and the sensitive guidance chips was sitting on the dock at the port of Charleston, waiting to be loaded onto the Nordic Star. Jared had turned the sales pit into a party zone. There were balloons. There were trays of sushi that smelled slightly fishy in the office heat. He was popping a bottle of champagne, the cork hitting the acoustic ceiling tile with a dull thud. "To the future," Jared shouted, raising a plastic flute. "To speed! To the end of bottlenecks!" I was in my office, the door closed. I was not celebrating, I was watching 2 screens. On the left, the maritime tracking map showing the Nordic Star preparing to depart. On the right, my personal email inbox. Because my name was still historically associated with the company in the government's logs, even though I had cut the active link, the system sent courtesy copies of major flags to my private email. At 2:13 p.m., the email arrived. All sender, nor reply at ace.cbp.dhs.gov subject, critical alert, detention notice, transaction ID, #99228 new. I opened it. The text was stark. The shipment associated with Bill of Lading Z99281 has been flagged for comprehensive inspection. Reason: Export Control Classification Number, ECCN, mismatch. Filer ID, invalid. High-risk dual-use technology detected without valid license exception. Because Jared had used the force submit override on the small electronic shipment yesterday, the system had learned the behavior. When the Project Zenith files generated, the system automatically applied Jared's developer mode preference. It tried to force submit a missile-grade technology export without a broker's license. The government computers didn't see a glitch. They saw an attempt to smuggle military-adjacent tech out of the country by an unauthorized entity. I read the email twice. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, not of fear, but of awe at the mechanical precision of justice. I stood up. I walked over to my bookshelf. I pulled down a pristine red binder. I took a 3-hole punch, punched the email, and clipped it inside. I labeled the page, Exhibit A, Failure to Supervise. I did not run out to stop the ship. The ship was already moving. I could see it on the map. The Nordic Star had cast off lines at 2 p.m. It was steaming toward the international limit. Outside, the party was getting louder. Someone had turned up music. Jared was laughing, his arm around the sales director, looking like the king of the world. I sat and watched the little green ship icon on my screen. It moved past the breakwater. It moved into the channel. It picked up speed. 12 knots. 15 knots. Then, at 3:45 p.m., the icon changed color. It went from green to flashing yellow. The speed dropped. 10 knots. 5 knots. 0 knots. The ship began to turn. A minute later, the music outside stopped. It started with a single ringtone, then another. Then the main switchboard lit up like a Christmas tree. I saw Bree pick up her desk phone. She listened for a second, her face going slack. She dropped the receiver. It dangled by its cord, swinging back and forth. Jared's cell phone rang. He pulled it out of his pocket, still smiling, still high on champagne and hubris. "Sterling here," he boomed. I watched him through the glass. I saw the moment the blood drained from his face. I saw his knees buckle slightly. He reached out and grabbed the edge of a desk to steady himself. "What do you mean, boarded?" he whispered. The room was silent enough for me to hear him through the glass. He listened for another 10 seconds. Then he lowered the phone. He looked around the room, his eyes wide, frantic, searching for an anchor. He looked at the sales team, who were staring back in confusion. He looked at the champagne bottle on the floor. And then, inevitably, he looked at me. I was sitting perfectly still, my hands folded on my desk, the red binder closed in front of me. I met his gaze. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked at him with the neutral, passive expression of a woman who was just archiving files. He realized it then. He realized that the bottleneck wasn't an obstruction. It was the plug. And he had just pulled it out of the bottom of the boat. Jared dropped his phone. He sprinted toward my office. He didn't knock. He threw the door open so hard it bounced off the stopper. "Vera!" he gasped, sweating, his eyes wild. "The ship! They stopped the ship. They say we don't have a license. They say it's a federal violation." I adjusted my glasses. "That sounds incredibly serious, Jared." "Fix it! Fix it!" he screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "Call them. Tell them it's a mistake. Use your thing. Your license." I stood up slowly. I picked up the red binder. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Jared. As per your instructions on Tuesday, I am no longer involved in operations. And as of Tuesday evening, I disassociated my personal license from this company to ensure I wasn't a bottleneck." You what?" "I stayed in my lane," I said softly. "And now, I believe the Coast Guard is in yours." The silence that descended upon my office following my declaration was not merely the absence of noise, it was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of sudden, terrifying realization that pressed against the glass walls and sucked the oxygen out of the room. Jared stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still gripping the brass handle, his chest heaving beneath the fabric of his bespoke Italian suit, which now seemed to hang awkwardly on a frame that had shrunk in the span of 10 seconds. His eyes, usually bright with the manic energy of unearned confidence, were now darting frantically between my calm, impassive face and the red binder sitting innocuously on my desk, as if he were a trapped animal trying to calculate an escape route from a cage he had built with his own hands. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to scream, perhaps to order me to pick up the phone and make the United States Coast Guard disappear with a magic wand, but the words died in his throat because deep down, beneath the layers of bravado and business school buzzwords, he understood the mechanical precision of the trap he had triggered. He backed out of the room slowly, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he attempted to smooth his tie, a reflex of a man trying to maintain the facade of control while the building burned down around him, and retreated to his corner office where, through the relentless transparency of the glass partitions, I watched him frantically dialing numbers, his gestures becoming more erratic and desperate with every call that inevitably went to voicemail or was met with the terrified confusion of subordinates who could not save him. The remainder of that afternoon dissolved into a chaotic symphony of panic that I observed from the sanctuary of my office with the detachment of a scientist watching a volatile chemical reaction finally reach its critical mass. The general counsel, a stern woman named Eleanor holding a thick leather portfolio like a weapon, arrived within the hour, followed closely by the chief executive officer, Mr. Vance, who walked with the heavy, trudging gait of a man who had aged 10 years since his morning coffee. They convened in the main conference room, the very same room where Jared had humiliated me just days prior and turned it into a war room. Through the glass, I could see the animated pointing of fingers, the slamming of fists on the mahogany table, and the way Jared kept gesturing wildly toward my office, weaving his narrative of blame, trying to construct a reality where he was the victim of a vengeful subordinate rather than the architect of his own destruction. I did not pace. I did not press my ear to the glass to eavesdrop. I simply continued my archival work, methodically scanning documents from 2015, ensuring that my workspace was immaculate, because in a storm of this magnitude, the only safe harbor is absolute, unassailable order. And I knew that my time to speak would come not when they were shouting, but when they were finally ready to listen to the silence. The summons came the following morning at 9 a.m. sharp, delivered not by an assistant, but by a calendar invitation from the Human Resources Director with the subject line, Urgent. Internal investigation regarding Project Zenith, a formal invitation to what they intended to be my execution. I smoothed my skirt, picked up my red binder, and walked into the conference room to find a tribunal waiting for me. The atmosphere was cold, smelling faintly of stale coffee and fear. Jared sat at the far end, looking pale but defiant, his eyes rimmed with red circles that betrayed a sleepless night. He was flanked by Eleanor, the general counsel, and the HR director, who refused to make eye contact with me, while Mr. Vance sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of grim exhaustion. There was a single empty chair placed in the center of the room, isolated from the table, designed to make the occupant feel small, defenseless, and interrogated a psychological tactic I had seen them use on non-compliant vendors and junior staff. I pulled the chair out, sat down with deliberate slowness, and placed my red binder on the table with a heavy, resonant thud that sounded like a gavel striking a sounding block. I did not feel small. I felt dangerous. Jared spoke first, and his voice had recovered some of its usual slickness, though it was brittle and cracked around the edges like dry parchment. He looked at Mr. Vance and began to spin a tale of insubordination and sabotage that was breathtaking in its audacity. He claimed that I had maliciously disconnected the compliance protocols without authorization, that I had failed to warn him of the specific regulatory triggers for the shipment, and that I had watched silently as the company walked into a disaster in a calculated attempt to destroy his reputation and hold the company hostage. He used words like negligence, entrapment, and dereliction of fiduciary duty, painting a picture of a bitter, aging employee who was willing to sink the entire ship just to prove a point to the captain. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of hatred and desperation, and accused me of professional malpractice, suggesting that my refusal to intervene when the error codes appeared constituted a breach of my employment contract and that I should be terminated immediately for cause to demonstrate to the authorities that the company was taking action against the rogue element responsible for the violation. I let the silence stretch after he finished, letting his accusations hang in the air until they began to sound thin, desperate, and overly rehearsed. I did not look at Jared. I kept my gaze fixed directly on Eleanor, the general counsel, because she was the only person in the room who understood that the law does not care about narratives, feelings, or corporate politics. It cares only about evidence. I opened my red binder slowly, the metal ring snapping open with a sound that echoed in the quiet room like a gunshot, and slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany table towards her. It was the email Jared had sent me on Tuesday, the one where he explicitly ordered me to remove myself from the operational approval chain, to transfer all override authority to his user profile, and to focus solely on archival duties to eliminate the bottleneck. I waited while Eleanor read it, watching her eyes narrow behind her reading glasses as she processed the timestamp and the unequivocal language. And then I spoke. My voice calm, measured, and devoid of the anger they expected. I explained that on Tuesday afternoon, in this very room, the Vice President of Operations had made a strategic executive decision to prioritize velocity over compliance, a directive I had followed with the utmost precision and obedience. I pointed out that he had specifically characterized my regulatory checks as obstacles to the company's agile delivery goals and had commanded me to stay in my lane, a phrase I repeated with careful, surgical emphasis. I detailed how I had disassociated my personal customs broker license from the company's profile, not out of malice, but out of absolute legal necessity, because a licensed broker cannot legally lend their name to a process they are explicitly forbidden from overseeing. To do so would be a violation of federal regulations, stripping me of my license and exposing me to personal criminal liability for transactions I could not verify. I told them, looking Mr. Vance in the eye, that I had not sabotaged the system. I had simply handed the keys to the person who demanded to drive. And the crash that followed was the direct result of his driving habits, not my absence from the passenger seat. Jared slammed his hand on the table, the noise making the HR director jump. He shouted that this was a technicality, a semantic game, that as a senior director, I had a moral obligation to stop him from making a catastrophic mistake, regardless of his orders, and that hiding behind an email was a cowardly act of passive aggression. He looked at Mr. Vance, pleading for support, arguing that no executive could be expected to know every obscure line of the Code of Federal Regulations and that he relied on his team to protect him from the weeds. It was a pivot from arrogance to victimhood, a desperate attempt to claim that his ignorance should be shielded by my competence, the very competence he had mocked as obsolescence just days before. He was trying to weaponize the very expertise he had discarded, claiming he was entitled to the protection of the shield he had thrown away. I reached into the binder again, bypassing his outburst as if he hadn't spoken, and pulled out the second document, the Exhibit A printout of the seizure notice. Beneath it, I revealed the final piece of evidence, a document I had received from Oren in IT just minutes before walking into the room. This was the kill shot. It was the immutable server log from Thursday afternoon, showing the exact timestamp when Jared Sterling's user account accessed the developer mode backend of the shipping software. I slid the log across the table to Eleanor, pointing to the line where the force submit command was executed. I explained, with the clinical detachment of a forensic auditor, that this was not a case of a manager missing a warning label or misunderstanding a complex rule. This was a documented instance of willful fraud. I described how the software had presented a hard stop, a compliance check failed warning, and how Jared had deliberately bypassed the safety protocol, using an administrative override designed for system testing to force the release of controlled technology without a license. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as Eleanor stared at the server log. She understood immediately what Jared did not, that incompetence is a fireable offense, but willful circumvention of an automated export control system is a federal felony. By forcing the system to submit a filing he knew was blocked, Jared had moved the company from the category of negligent to criminal intent in the eyes of the Department of Justice. The fines would not be negotiable. The investigation would not be brief. And if the company wanted to survive, they could not be seen defending the man who pulled the trigger. Eleanor slowly looked up from the paper, her face pale, and turned her gaze to Jared. It was a look of absolute professional severance, the look a lawyer gives a client they know they cannot save. Mr. Vance, who had been silent until this moment, finally spoke, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. He asked Jared if it was true, if he had manually overridden the safety block after being told the license was invalid. Jared stammered, his confidence evaporating into a puddle of sweat, trying to explain that he thought it was a glitch, a bug in the legacy system, that he was just trying to get the product to the customer as promised, that he was showing initiative. He looked small, shrinking into his expensive suit, the aura of the disruptor, replaced by the pathetic reality of a man who had broken a machine he didn't understand and was now terrified of the bill. Mr. Vance didn't wait for him to finish. He stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out at the gray skyline of the city, his back to the room, and said quietly that the company was facing a minimum of $10 million in fines and a complete audit of every shipment made in the last 5 years. He turned back to Jared and told him to place his badge and phone on the table. He was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending the investigation, and security was waiting outside to escort him from the building. Jared looked at me one last time as he stood up, his eyes wide with shock, looking for some sign of mercy or remorse in my face. I gave him neither. I simply watched him place his badge on the mahogany table, right next to my red binder. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. As the security guards let him out, he didn't look like a vice president. He looked like a ghost. Mr. Vance turned back to the table and looked at me, his eyes tired and pleading. He admitted that mistakes were made, that the leadership transition had been mishandled, and that he recognized the immense value of my institutional knowledge. He pushed a thick folder toward me, a retention offer. I could see the edge of the paperwork. It likely contained a significant raise, a new title, perhaps Vice President of Compliance, and a promise to restore my authority. He asked me to help them fix this. He asked me to talk to the auditors, to use my personal reputation with the Customs Board to negotiate a settlement, to clean up the mess that Jared had made. He told me that the company needed me now more than ever to survive the coming storm, appealing to my loyalty, my 15 years of service, and the fact that this company was, in many ways, my life's work. I looked at the folder. It represented security. It represented vindication. It represented a victory in the corporate game. But then I looked at the red binder that contained the record of my humiliation. I thought about the 15 years I had given this company, the nights I had stayed late, the holidays I had worked, the silent pride I took in keeping them safe, only to be discarded the moment a shiny new object appeared. I realized that staying would not be a victory, it would be a capitulation. If I stayed to clean up this mess, I would be proving that they could abuse me, discard me, and then whistle for me to come back whenever they broke something. I would be teaching them that my dignity had a price, and that price was a title bump and a raise. I stood up and pushed the retention offer back across the table, unopened. The sound of the folder sliding across the wood was the final punctuation mark of my career at Apex Meridian. I told Mr. Vance that the mess was structural, not just operational, and that while I could fix a compliance error, I could not fix a culture that viewed expertise as a bottleneck and arrogance as a virtue. I informed him that my resignation was effective immediately, that I would be taking my personal license with me, and that I had already accepted a position as a senior consultant with the firm representing the European consortium, the very client they had just failed. I told him that I would be advising them on how to select logistics partners who actually understood the definition of executive presence. I walked out of the conference room, leaving the red binder on the table as my final report. I walked past my office, past the stunned faces of the staff who had heard the shouting, and pressed the button for the elevator. As the doors opened, I saw the security guards returning from escorting Jared out. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and as the doors slid shut, blocking out the view of Apex Meridian Logistics for the last time, I didn't feel the rush of triumph or the thrill of revenge. I felt peace. It was the deep, resonant peace of a machine that has finally been turned off after running too hot for too long. 6 months later, the fallout was still making headlines in the industry trade journals. Apex Meridian was hit with a $12 million fine from the Department of Commerce and was placed on a probationary, denied persons list that required them to have every single shipment manually audited by an NP external monitor for the next 3 years, a process that tripled their shipping times and caused an exodus of their major clients. Their stock price had plummeted, and rumors of a hostile takeover were circulating. Jared Sterling was facing federal charges for export fraud. His MBA and his tailored suits offered no protection against the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for trafficking in dual-use technology. I was sitting on the deck of my new home office, overlooking a quiet lake, the morning mist rising off the water. I was reviewing a contract for my consultancy firm. The work was steady, the pay was double what I had made at Apex, and most importantly, my clients listened when I spoke. My phone buzzed with a notification, a LinkedIn update. It was from Bree, Jared's former assistant. She had sent a connection request with a short note. I'm applying for a junior compliance role at another firm. I was wondering if you could teach me how to read the regulations? I don't want to just drive anymore. I want to know how the engine works. I smiled, taking a sip of my tea. I accepted the connection. The world didn't need more people who knew how to press the accelerator. It needed people who knew where the brakes were. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just the invisible hand keeping the disaster at bay. I was the one deciding which way the ship would turn. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to shout or to fight for your seat at the table. Sometimes, the ultimate power move is simply to pick up your license, walk out the door, and let them feel the crushing weight of your absence. They mistake silence for weakness, forgetting that it is often the sound of a foundation being removed. In a world loud with incompetence, sometimes the most devastating move isn't to scream, but simply to step back and let gravity do the rest. If you have ever quietly packed your boxes and walked away from a place that didn't value you, know that you didn't quit, you graduated. If this story spoke to you, please like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, what was your moment of silence?